I brought this palm branch because I want to talk a little bit about Palm Sunday, as most will know it. The feast that celebrates the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, which was shortly before Passover. But the root of this feast goes way back. We can find it in the book of Exodus chapter 12, where it's just before the 10th plague will come upon the Egyptians. 9 plagues have already happened, and now the 10th plague is going to come. And there in Exodus 12, God tells Moses to tell the children of Israel to set apart a unblemished lamb on the 10th of that month, Nisan. And they are to keep this lamb in their houses for 4 days until the 14th of Nisan, and then they had to kill it and put the blood on the doorposts. And that following night, death would come and kill all firstborn men and animals, except there where this blood was on the doorpost. And so there death would pass over. Hence the name Passover. That's why I prefer to use this word and not the word Easter, which actually refers to the goddess Ishtar and has to do with the fertility festivals that pagan cultures celebrate in springtime. So that's a whole separate thing. But so the Israelites were taking these lambs into their houses, and that was quite a thing. If we look at the 10 plagues, they all deal with a separate god that the Egyptians had, and in every plague one of these gods is shown to be powerless. And one of the very important gods was the ram god, called Knum or Ammon. And so these lambs were actually holy animals in Egypt. So God allowed the Israelites to take lambs into their houses without intervention from the Egyptians. That by itself was a miracle. And that is why in the Jewish tradition the Sabbath before Passover remembers this event. And that Sabbath is called Shabbat HaGadol. So it's a great Sabbath. And that is actually what we call Palm Sunday. But obviously it was not on a Sunday. But in that instance, and in the instance of Jesus' entrance in Jerusalem, it was Shabbat. And the lamb that was set apart was called the Korban Pesach, the Passover lamb. And during the days that the people had it in their house, they had to observe and inspect to see that this lamb was unblemished indeed. But you can imagine that having a small lamb in your house for several days, especially when there are children in the house, you get attached to this animal, and it's even harder than after 4 days to actually kill it. It hurts. And so that was the part of the idea of what God was foreshadowing. When we look at Jesus' entrance in Jerusalem, people were lauding him as a king. That was actually the only day throughout Jesus' ministry that he was recognized as a king. Only that day, and that day actually was exactly prophesied by the prophet Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. To the day it was prophesied hundreds of years before that this would happen. And the people were standing at the eastern gate where Jesus was coming in on the back of a colt of a donkey, and they had palm branches like these. And like in Israel we have palm trees here, and so I took one of these branches, and you see it's quite big. It's about the size probably their head. This makes some impression if many people stand along the road waving with these big branches. And that is actually a strange event to happen in that time of the year, because they would do this at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in the end of the season. But prophetically, these are connected, because eventually Jesus will enter again into Jerusalem through that same gate. This gate, by the way, that is now being closed for hundreds of years already. Because of that fact, Muslims closed it because they wanted to prevent the Messiah from returning. But we know from Scripture that gate will be opened again, and Jesus will enter through that same gate again. And that time he will rule as king. He will stay there and rule as king on this earth. And that we say, in other words, he will live among us, he will tabernacle among us. So that might very well happen indeed on the Feast of Tabernacles itself. And people will most likely again stand there with palm branches. So it's a foreshadow of that. But it's also the selection of the Korban Pesach, of the Passover lamb, what happened on that day when Jesus entered Jerusalem. And indeed, in the time spent from that day until 4 days later, when he was crucified, he was arrested, he was put on trial. They were literally inspecting to see whether he had any blemish. And by the way, they could not find anything, and therefore they needed false witnesses to accuse him and to get him sentenced to death. And so all that God had already shown in the Exodus, about 1400 years before that, that was fulfilled now in Jesus on the exact same days. And so Passover, the crucifixion, was 4 days after that Sabbath. Now, of course, in the biblical sense, the Passover is always on the 14th of the month of Nisan, and so the selection of the lamb is 4 days before, on the 10th. And since it's on a fixed date, it's not always on the same day. So it's not Shabbat HaGadol is not always on a Shabbat. So the way the Christian churches celebrate it, Palm Sunday, always on a Sunday, and the Sunday afterwards always the Resurrection Day. This, of course, is not biblically, it's not correct. But okay, let's put that aside. The point is that by getting this lamb into your house, you get attached to it, and then the sacrifice of that lamb, it hurts you because it's your lamb. It's not just any lamb, it's your lamb. And that is what maybe is the message of today, that or the question: did you indeed take Jesus, the Pesach Korban, the Passover lamb, into your house, into your heart? Did you make him your lamb? And think about that, whether that is so, whether he is indeed the king that you allow to enter into your heart and to rule over your life. That is the beautiful message that we get from this Palm Sunday or Shabbat HaGadol, and from our Passover lamb, your Passover lamb, I hope, Pesach Korban, Yeshua HaMashiach, our Messiah.